Okay, so that's us recording, and then I will go to the learning page. Okay, so first section, just so that everyone remembers, where you'll find all the information is if, once again, on the learn page for the course materials, project 1B, because that's still the part of the project where we're making an assessment of the gender neutral shirt. So the brief is there first, and then the gender neutral shirt pattern cutting instructions. So I've already opened all of these, and also I did put a note in that I'd added a pocket drafting for 0.5, but then I have since realized this morning that I had already added the pocket to the second note. So there's just an additional one there if anybody feels they want to, re-go over it. But the first one I'm going to go over is drafting the button stand. So when you click on it, this is the note that will come up. So as you see here, just go over a brief reasoning behind the button stand. Key component of the shirt obviously allows for the opening and closing of the garment. There are several variations of button stands that can be done in shirt design, and I think that's important to go over because this technique that you're doing for the gender neutral shirt will result in a concealed button stand. But you can do exposed button stands. You could do ruler loops and buttons, which would involve less adding of seam allowance to either each of the center fronts. So there are different ways that you could approach it depending on the design of the shirt that you want to do. The good thing about the concealed button stand is that it's probably one of the most complicated, and I don't mean complicated as in difficult to execute. It's just the fact that you have the different seam allowances on each side with different measurements. So in doing this one, you'll be able to then apply the theory to this to any other shirt button stand that you want to do when it comes to your own designs. So first part of the note is the first thing you need to do is draw the center front, the front panel of the shirt, and make sure that you draw two kind of mirror images of each other, but you need to make sure that you leave enough of a gap in between them when you're applying it to the pattern paper. This is because of the different measurements that you need on either side. So I've said leave at least 20. On the mock-up, I put 22. Really, as long as you leave it between 20-25 centimeters, you've got plenty of space between it. So you can decide that based on the width of the paper that you have, just in case you're working with, scrap bits of pattern paper that you've got left and you don't have like a big enough roll piece. So this is where it starts getting, you have to pay attention to the measurements and focus on what you're adding, because on the panel on the left, you're going to add 5.5 centimeters. And then on the panel on the right, you're going to add 9.4 centimeters. So you can see that it's just extending the whole thing out. So this will always still be your center front, which is the original line of the shirt. What you're just adding here is what you're going to eventually divide and fold and stitch so that you get the button stands. The larger of the pieces is where the concealed side comes in. So the 5.5 is going to be the more traditional side. And as I said, this you can apply to other button stand designs if you do it. So if you wanted it to be exposed and you wanted to make a feature of the buttons that you're putting on the shirt, you could do both of them 5.5, and it would just give you that more kind of classic Oxford style. The shirt pattern should have the two little notches for I say notches, more like holes, for the placement of the pocket. So it's important to mark that on the right side as well. I say the right side just because that's what we've applied it to in the sample, and it's more traditional. There's nothing to stop you if you wanted to put it in on the left side or if you wanted to put it in a different place. It's just that this method of doing it is more traditional. Now then when you scroll down to step 3, you'll see that start dividing up all the different sections on the button stand. So it's important to mark these measurements down. So on the left, which is the part that will be more exposed, you mark 1.1 centimeters in all the way down. So you can see you've got this new kind of channel, then 2.2, then 2.2. So the last two are the same, but the first one is that 1.1, and that just allows you when you're folding it over to have a bit of give when you fold it and stitch it down. The instructions for assembling the button stand, which is the blog post that Juliet has done, when it comes to actually stitching it, we'll go into more detail as to how you fold all these pieces over. So when you get to that stage, we can either discuss that or you can contact Juliet for support, but I'll touch on that when we finish this session as well. Step 4 is the right side of the shirt where you have a lot more measurements to add. So obviously this is the wider piece, and you can see how it's broken down. 2.5 on either side here, and then from the inside 2 rows of 1.1 and then one of 2.2. So again, it looks like it's quite complicated with all those lines that I've added in, but when it comes to folding it all, you just have to pay close attention to the instructions on the blog post when you're sewing it up. So that literally is the button stand. So it is quite simple what you're adding there. The only thing, so as I said, I did realize that I have done 2 notes for the pocket now. So, you can pick which one you choose to follow. But here I've just put in the measurements of how you would get the shape of it. So there's a 12cm square here. I think on the second one I did it slightly smaller based on the sample. So either is completely right. It's up to you how you approach it. And then you would just mark up 1.5 at the bottom on either side to create the V shape of the pocket. Then once you trace it off, see here it's just adding the 2cm lip at the top, which allows you to fold the pocket back on itself so that it's nice and clean finished, and then add seam allowance to it. So what I'm going to do is going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, and I just want to check if anybody's got any questions on that, if anybody's tried it, if anybody wants to ask anything, it's not a problem.
Does it matter what side? Does it matter what side you choose to put the larger?
Not necessarily, Morven, because eventually, what I would say is just make sure when you cut it out in fabric that you're doing it that way, because you want that to be on the right side and on top, so that it conceals all the buttons. So it doesn't matter in paper necessarily. Like if you've done that side on the left, like you can just flip it when it comes to the material. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine.
Does anybody else have any other questions? No silly questions, obviously. Go for it.
So do we not have to put the centimetre seam allowance for the shirt for that? Does that make sense?
That I'm just going to go into on the next seam allowance section. So don't worry. Like that's the first part, and then we'll go into the seam allowance part. But I just want to check if anybody's tried it, had any questions, or if anybody's confused by anything, just let me know.
So the pocket, we add 2 centimeters for the facing and then an additional centimeter. So basically 3.
Yes, all the way. Basically, you're adding the 2 to the top of the pocket. So it's almost like when you look at, wait, I'll just share my screen again.
So it's just at the very top.
Right. Yeah, and that's only going to be where you fold it back on itself. So 2 seconds, Marcella, and I'll just share again.
And then we don't add the 1 centimeter on top because it doesn't need one?
No, so here, so this is your original, once you get the original square, you then add the 2 centimeters to the top, and that's so that you can fold it over. But then once you've added that 2 centimeters, you then add a centimeter all the way around it. So that's so that you can clean finish the top edge of the pocket when it folds back on itself.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions? All clear? And also what is good is that the next session, which will be the drop-in, I'll just be here from 2 till 4. So as you're working on it, if you want to come in and ask a quick question, or if you want to show me to double check it, like we can do that as well. If not, and you don't get it finished this afternoon, or you want to check in before next Thursday, you can always just email me like a picture of how you've gotten on with it, and I can just double check it and make sure it's right. Okay? Thumbs up if that's clear. Great. Okay, so the next part of the instructions is the seam allowance. So that part's a little bit more complicated, but I'll show you just now. Back to my pages. Okay, so again, notes in a similar way, just to go over the different constructions that are involved in the shirt. So the reason why there's different seam allowances is that there are different kind of constructions used in the shirt. There's traditional seam allowances, traditional seams, felled seams, and French seams. So at certain points on the pattern pieces. Sorry, did I go muted again? Keep getting a notification. No, perfect. So on here, you'll be able to see the as the instructions go, the different steps of the where you add the seam allowance. So if I scroll down to the first page, what I've done is use the left panel of the front. So you'll see that it goes over where you're adding the seam allowance to and how much you're actually adding. The important thing to note, so I think Helen, you were about to ask, is that the seam allowance only runs to the new center front. You don't add seam allowance onto this side of the button stand. So you start from the top, you do 1 centimeter at the neckline, 1 centimeter at the shoulder, and then 1.5 for the armhole, the side seam, and the hem. So it seems like you're adding a lot more to those pieces, but when it comes to the construction and the order of which you put it together, it will make a lot more sense. Usually, when it comes to something which is more basic, you'd probably sew the shoulder seam and the side seams first. But with this shirt, you sew the shoulder seam and then you start to attach the sleeve. So again, that will all kind of come into, you'll see the order of it and it'll make a lot more sense once you get started on the making of the shirt. Does that part make sense, or does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, sorry,
Kind of-
just about the button stand. So you draft the button stand on top of the center front, and then you draw the seam allowance only around the old center front?
So basically, when you've extended out from the original center front to add the button stand, you're not adding an additional centimeter onto the new center front. So you know your button stand has extended that center front out. You're only starting from the neck edge. You don't add an centimeter. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
At the top, all the way around, and then when you get to the hem, you also stop at what is the new center front.
Yeah.
Charlotte, were you going to ask something, or someone else going to say something?
I was gonna ask that question. So it's perfect.
Right, I'll put the rest now, and then we'll come back for more questions. So obviously the back, you're missing the yoke. So for the yoke seam, you do the centimeter along the back. Because you're cutting the back piece on the fold, obviously you don't need any seam allowance at the center back because you're going to cut that against the folded fabric. And then the same principle to the back panel. 1.5 around the armhole, 1.5 at the side seam, and 1.5 at the hem. What I should say, sorry, just quickly, is that what you're doing to this front panel, so this example I've used is the shorter of the extended button stand, so the left panel, you do the same thing to the right panel. So it'll look very similar, except from the fact on the right panel, you just have a longer extension for the button stand. And then here for the yoke seam, shoulder seam 1 centimeter, neck 1 centimeter, yoke seam 1 centimeter, just that 1.5 on the armhole, so that when you connect the yoke seam to the center back panel, the armhole will all be 1.5. And then the actual sleeve is a bit easier, 1.5 around everything apart from the opening, so the cuff section, that's only going to be 1 centimeter. This is basically what you will end up with once you're finished. Does anybody have any questions on that?
David, are we going to be seeing your screen right now?
I just...
Yeah, you're not sharing your screen.
That's fine. Do that again. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Perfect. I'll just go back over. Didn't sync. So we've done the front panel. Did we get the yokes, the back panel, or did that not show up?
It didn't show up.
Perfect. Well, not perfect, but I'll go over it again. So the back panel, 1.5 around everything as the front, you know, like the hem, the side seam, the armhole, but where you have that yoke seam, that's going to be 1 centimeter. So you'll see here, I've just called that out. What you don't need to worry about is adding any seam allowance onto the center back seam because you're going to cut that on the fold. Then when it comes to the yoke panel, 1 centimeter around the neck, 1 centimeter around the shoulder, 1 on this seam here, which will connect to the back. But then armhole, you do 1.5 again, just to make sure that this part of the armhole and this part of the armhole are all the same seam allowance. Then once you get to the sleeve, 1.5 around both of the sides, and then 1.5 around the actual sleeve head. And then the opening, so where the cuff is going to be, that's only 1 centimeter. Basically, what you're going to end up with all the pattern pieces is that they will look like this. In addition to this, you'll also already have your collar, but you've already added the seam allowance to that, and you've got the collar on the stand, so that you're good to go there, and it's just these pieces here. Oh wait, I'll show again. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't know if this is relevant to this section.
No.
Do you know these smaller bits? Are they got seam allowance on already?
They've already got seam allowance. So that was just, we don't have a note for that. So what I was just going to say on the end of all of those main pieces, so all those main body pieces, they all have you need to add the centimeter, all the seam allowance, sorry. But all those little pieces that are for the cuff, so those are the placket, the guard, the cuff, they don't need any seam allowance.
Okay, so all the cuff pieces have been done.
All done.
That's fine.
Just for everybody who's joining, who's direct entry and like doesn't know how usually we would have done it if we were in the studio, when it comes to the drafting sizes, so it's going to be the same thing when it gets to the coat when you're in 3rd year. We would get you to do the collar, so you understand the drafting principles, the seam allowances of the main body parts. But when it gets to the kind of like smaller pieces that are more fiddly, such as the cuff, and then when it gets to the coat in 3rd year, it's the jetted pocket, the flap, and the pocket bag. We've already added all the seam allowance onto them, and they're all notched ready to go, just so that it's one thing that you don't have to focus on. That part's already done. Does that make sense? So does anybody have any questions about the seam allowance?
Are we just adding on, this might be a really stupid question, but are we just adding on the seam allowances and things to the pattern that we've already got, or are we redrawing it all?
No, don't redraw it all, just the seam allowance. The only thing I would say, I'm saying don't draw around it all, I'm just thinking of saving people time. If you want to keep a master block, which doesn't have allowance, and then have a separate pattern for the shirt, I would draw around it all, but that's more if you've got OCD like me and you just want it to be all like organized. So you want to have the original piece, then the new shirt, and then whatever you adapt to it. But I think that that's more long-term wise. You may want to keep the master copy to use in another project or something else. Because that's how I would do it, but I think that not a lot of people need to do that. So don't worry about doing that if you don't want to.
Wait, so if we just cut out the pattern that you gave us and then draw around it onto pattern paper and add the seam allowance on top of that, then we'll still have a master block and the extra pattern.
Yeah, Anushka, that's totally right. You'd have then your master copy and your new copy. The only thing that's important to remember, just to stress, if you're transferring over and you're doing like a separate piece, make sure and copy over every single notch that's on the original shirt, because you'll need all them when it comes to like putting it all together. Okay?
Yeah.
I'd probably say that you should do like because I've done mine like copied it out, but then to do that middle button stand, you have to cut it out and then redraw it because the shirt pieces are too close together.
Okay, so then maybe that helps with that. You'd have to redraw them anyway, because I'm not sure. When you got the copy from Juliet, are the fronts quite close together? Is there not much of a gap?
Yeah, it doesn't leave a 20cm gap. So I've literally got, I don't know if you can see that, but I've literally just drawn it all out again. Okay. It's taken me like 500 years, but like we're getting there, you know?
Slowly but surely, slowly but surely. It just means that by the time you finish, you'll have this perfect pattern, Charlotte.
I hope so. Like, mustn't mess it up.
No, it'll be fine. Does anybody else have any other questions? Because what I'm going to do now, so that's all the seam allowance and the button stands and the pocket. I'm just going to move on to what interfacing you're going to apply to certain pieces. So that's kind of the next step. Do you want me to go over that now, or do you want to wait until you've done all the pattern pieces?
I'd rather do it now, because then we might be finishing at a different time and stuff.
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, let's get it done.
Yeah.
Let's go over everything. Okay, so share. You can all see my screen again, yeah?
Yeah, thanks. I can see it.
Okay, so the next part is, well, once you've got all your pattern pieces organized and you've got everything cut out with the seam allowances ready to go and all the notches, you need to apply interfacing to certain pieces of the shirt. So, if you've ever looked, I'm sure you all have, if you've ever looked at a shirt that you own, you'll see that, the collar always feels slightly stiffer. There's the collar stand, which feels slightly stiffer. Your button stands will feel more secured because they've also got interfacing applied to them. So this note here just shows you where you're applying it to on each part. So the first part is the collar. So you've already got your collar pieces. What you also want to do is use them without the seam allowance and cut them out in interfacing. So once you're basically kind of taking a little step backwards, but on interfacing, just cut out one top collar and one under collar with no seam allowance, also on the fold, so you have one long strip. So when you apply them to the wrong side of the fabric for the top collar and the stand, it would look something like this. So the grayed out piece of material with the diagonal lines is representing the interfacing. Is that clear, or has anybody got any questions? Okay, perfect. So then the next step is the interfacing. So for the button stand, you don't need to cut these out as like pattern pieces. You just need to cut 2 strips of interfacing that is these measurements. So 2 centimeters by 66 centimeters.
You're not sharing your screen again.
Oh, okay, thanks. Teams is really failing me today. Okay, so here I'll go back again. So yeah, button stand interfacing. 2 strips of interfacing. You don't do it as pattern pieces. Just use your ruler and cut them out like straight lines, because you don't need the cardboard strip for this. 2 centimeters by 66. When you're applying these, sure you apply them to the wrong side. So you'll see when I've represented it on these pattern pieces, they're flipped as opposed to these instructions. So on these instructions, I shall go down to this pattern piece here. I know, that's it. Yeah. So here I've got the left pattern piece, which has the smaller of the 2 button stands, and then the right piece has the longer of the 2 button stands. But on the interfacing, because you're putting the interfacing onto the wrong side, I've flipped them so that you're looking at them as you would be if you had flipped the fabric over to the wrong side. This doesn't matter so much because you're doing calico. Like calico doesn't, it's such a plain weave fabric that it doesn't really have a wrong side of the fabric. Like you could use either side and it kind of pretty much looks the exact same. But this would matter if you were doing something, if you were making your own shirt and you were doing it in like a cotton twill or like a sateen or a printed fabric, you would need to make sure you apply these to the wrong side. So if you look at where they're placed, because you'll have notched where the folds are on the button stand, you're literally putting the first strip 1 channel in on the longer of the 2 button stands. So see here, it's like, you know, when you added all those lines, this is on the second strip, and it's the same with the shorter side. So you basically just want to leave 1 complete folding panel and then place the interfacing. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then what's the last part? 2 seconds.
Wait, so David, do you want us to cut out the interfacing today as well, or is it just the paper we're doing?
The interfacing, Emily, like if you could aim to have that done for next Thursday before we go into full assembly. So what you'll see is that next Thursday I've set tutorials which are all 20 minutes back to back, and I'll send an email out ahead of next Thursday. But the plan for that is that you can either start making, follow the instructions. So I'll talk through that, the stages of that just now as well, so you can either start before Thursday or you're starting on Thursday, and then we can have a discussion as to how you're going to approach it. Because some people, I think, will take the shirt and will want to be doing it traditionally, and we've got the blog post for that so that it follows step by step. But I know from some discussions with a few of you, you're thinking about applying like the make don't make principle to how you put the shirt together and using different seam techniques, and you want to explore different things. So next Thursday we'll be able to go through how you plan to make it, and we can have like a discussion on which part you're going to do which way. So as long as the interfacing is done by next Thursday, that's absolutely fine.
Wait, so is this for the gender neutral one and the one that we're doing ourselves?
No, this is just the gender neutral one, because once you finish the gender neutral shirt, which I'll check the planner, I think the plan is that you'll finish making that by a week next Thursday, so 2 weeks today. But I think that a lot of you might already be finished by then. You might be starting to think about your own designs, but we'll take that more on like a 1-by-1 basis. Like the planner's there to keep everybody right. So if it still takes you the next 2 following Thursdays, that's not a problem. I don't want anybody to worry. Like it's just that if you want to start earlier on your own designs because you finished the shirt, that's not a problem.
Sorry, so for the coming Thursday, do you just want it out on paper, or should we start cutting it on fabric?
Start cutting out on fabric, but don't worry. What I'll do is I'll send an email, Helen, either the end of today or we'll go over it on Monday when we do the next project launch, to talk about having it all cut out ready for Thursday.
So
as long as you focus on getting all the pattern pieces kind of done today, even just for yourself as like an own like kind of timeline, get it all kind of organized today, tomorrow, it means that next week you already know that you've finished all the pattern side of this exercise and you're moving into the construction side.
David, can I ask for like making your own patterns for your own shirts? I'm going to be doing, I think my design's going to be poppers.
Okay.
So all my seams are going to be put together with like, I don't know, proper things. I'm obviously going to have to enhance the seam allowance quite a lot, to be able to accommodate that. But will we talk about that in like individual crits?
Yeah, we will. And also as well, so you'll have your Monday is just the project launch and a presentation from me and Annika. And then we're going to go in, so the individual tutorials will be on the Thursday pattern cutting session. But Charlotte, there's nothing to stop you, if you've got poppers and you want to experiment, starting to plan what that might look like. You know, like if you're using poppers, you probably might need a 2 centimeter extension and another extension so that it folds back on itself and it's all neatly trapped in. So you can start to play a bit.
Like, you know how you can pop them like that to have the material over it? I'm thinking of having them popped like that, so it kind of, your seams out the way.
Yeah, so it sticks out a little bit. So you'd still need the fold, like you'd still need the material to fold in itself though, so you can get a nice clean finish and then put the popper through it. Does that make sense?
I was thinking about that, or I was gonna do overlock the edges in like a contrasting thread and then pop her.
You'll do a lot of samples on that and then we'll talk about that. We'll see, depending on how resolved they are, but like do definitely go ahead and start sampling that if you're interested in that. It's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. And then I think there's one last piece for the interfacing, so I'll just show you that quickly as well. I think it's the cuff. Everybody see the screen okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh no, that is everything finished. Oh. Never mind, that's everything finished. So does anybody have any questions on that? Do you feel like it's clear, ready to get started? So like we go to the next meeting and it's literally like a drop in. You can come in and check how you're getting on. Yeah. Well, I'll stop this meeting now. I'll get the recording and I'll try and aim to have that on Learn while I'm kind of in the next meeting so that it's ready for everybody to start referencing. And then I'll be at the next meeting from now until 4. So if anybody's got any questions, we can just go over them. Sound good?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. I'll see you at the drop in.